All right, say, why don't we, let's start. So I guess maybe I go to other sessions and they always say, you should know that this is being recorded. So I guess I should say that too. Susan Green had turned that on before. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jack Glassman, honored to chair this committee that's well over 100 years old, Historic Resources Committee. By day, I am a historical architect with the National Park Service, the regional office. Broadcasting here from the place now called Charlestown. It's part of the ancestral homelands of the Massachusetts people. They called this place Mishawang. So I think it's a good thing that so many of the Native American names in this region have been preserved. So why don't we just start with, as we typically do, just some items of notes and current events. And please do feel free to, if you have any thoughts to share about anything or opinions or something, then feel free to just jump in. It doesn't need to be just my talking head and slideshow. So just noted recently that Richard Dryhouse, who was a historic preservation champion in Chicago. He was an investor, philanthropist, classical architecture enthusiast, advocate for preservation, and apparently is also a bit of a practical joker too. I guess he gave some party and he rode into the party on an elephant apparently. But he was not a fan of modern architecture apparently, but he certainly loved traditional design. He in 2007 he opened the Richard Dryhouse. I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing his name right. Dryhouse, yeah, a museum of decorative arts museum in this mansion that's shown here. And there was also the Dryhouse Architecture Prize that was established in 2003 at the University of Notre Dame. So passed away at 78 years old. And you might have seen the recent news that the Virginia Supreme Court ruled that Charlottesville's Confederate memorials, the two of them, the statues, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, ruled that they can finally come down. This has been at the city level, residents, they've been petitioning to remove these statues for a number of years. And it all, of course, came to the head with the Unite the Right rally and the tiki torches and Heather Heyer being killed. So it made its way up through appeals and so on, and then the Supreme Court has just ruled that in this case, these a later law, the question had to do with a law that had been passed that forbid removing war statues, and they had to make their way through that. So there's no timetable, I guess, to remove them at this point, but that is, the city's been cleared to do that. And this, by the way, does not affect the Governor Northam's plan in Richmond to remove statues there. So that not part of this particular narrow ruling. So there is a starting as early as tomorrow, actually, a 4-part virtual conference about art museums and the legacies of the Dutch slave trade. You can see information here. This all really was inspired by I'm trying to see her first name. That's Mallory. It was really inspired by the Amsterdam Museum announced in 2019 that it would no longer refer to the Dutch Republic's most robust period of cultural and economic ascendancy as its golden age, which was a term that I say he glosses over the gross inequities of the period. Sarah Mallory, she's a doctoral candidate at the Harvard Department of Art and Architectural History and a scholar of the period. She took notice of that, and that sort of inspired her to curate and create this this program. Because that term golden age, as the article I'm reading an announcement on the Globe about, it's so integrated into the way people think about the Netherlands in the 17th century and the incredible flowering of arts and culture, Rembrandt, Vermeer, Van Dyck. It's also a signal to remember some incredibly important reasons why that flowering was able to happen, which was the spoils, namely the spoils of the Dutch slave trade. So it looks like it's going to be really great series there, and it's co-sponsored by, presented by the Center for Netherlandish Art at the Museum at the MFA, the Harvard Art Museum, and Harvard University's Department of History of Art and Architecture. So sad and angry news about this sudden demolition of the Paul Rudolph House in Delray Beach, part of the famous Sarasota School. Although this was considered, I guess, by the aficionados somewhat of a departure in some ways, a unique version of that among Paul Rudolph's work. The bottom picture is a rendering of what the proposal that sort of had been on the table, and there have been discussions and meetings and travel and so on with the Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation, who now feel blindsided, as do the local officials too, by the sudden decision to demolish the building, ostensibly because it was in such poor condition that they found that they couldn't do the preservation work. In addition, it was a combined, as the rendering maybe suggests, preservation and then enhancing it to, their plan was to try to bring back some of the original design that had been altered over the years. So the owners are now saying they're going to reconstruct it. And here's where they kind of I don't know, I guess the kind of philosophy of what is reconstruction. So they made this plan, but without notifying all these other parties that have been involved, the other stakeholders. So the plan is to totally reconstruct it. So they are arguing that would still, that it should still be listed then locally as a landmark once that happens. And so there are others who kind of take umbrage to that, as rebuilding to its exact 1955 state. Is that a reconstruction really, or is it a new building that's just a replica? Their attorney had said it was in such poor condition that the Historic Preservation Board should have realized originally that approving renovations and addition and demolition, that it also meant approving a potential demolition of the original home. So there's the wordplay for that. So anyone has any thoughts about that? Good article that I'm reading here that was from the Architect's newspaper that really concludes with a question. It was the beginning question, which is, how did this happen? New York City, the Madison Avenue, the former Whitney Museum of American Art that then became the Met, Breuer, I think they called it, designed by Marcel Breuer in 1966. This has kind of been in the works for a while, but it's now, I guess it's now happening that the Frick collection will be opening a new temporary home in the building. So who says that minimalist examples of brutalism are white elephants? So And they're really, I guess they're really running with this kind of notion about, rather than, where in the Frick, this opulent mansion with all the dripping with moldings and all that, and these paintings, and all the Vermeers and and some Rembrandts as well, and Goya and others, will be for 2 years or so moved and kind of this interaction with the raw concrete and interiors and architecture. So it sounds like it's going to be a great sort of a synergy, I guess, might say, of the two. So it sounds like it's going to be quite an exciting adventure, I guess, in sight and presenting the art in a different way. Speaking of Frick being ostentatious, here's back in Massachusetts with a backlog of cases. The state, the courts are getting creative, looking for safer, with distancing, safer trial locations. So recent article in the Globe and other places reported this, that they, including this here, Lombardo's and Randolph, some nightclubs, a former movie theater in Springfield, a Holiday Inn in Pittsfield, function rooms at a Cape Cod resort that features a water park, all being repurposed to use for trial courts. Great example of creative adaptive use. And some of that, of course, having chandeliers and so on, I suppose it lends itself to, in some ways, to the formality of that's appropriate for the law to proceed. Although not necessarily the multicolored LED lights. They need all of those. Our dear Huntington Theater renovation and major project, I guess $55 million project, and in all part of a over $100 million capital campaign. The plan that's sort of been in progress and was moving slowly was to 2 phases: to build a residential tower, which at its ground floor would include a lobby, an expansive lobby for the Huntington, the tower adjacent to it. And then phase 2 would include restoration and additions and expansion of the theater space itself. But with the pandemic and everything else going on, the new announcement is that the Playhouse is fast tracking the renovation, doing as phase 1 the renovations to the building, and the Brunner Cott, the lower picture rendering, I think, is showing some of the improvements that are including wider seats. I think it's a little bit of a reduction in the number of seats, but having been there many times, I know that it's a little compact in terms of seating. But not only that, but also additional program space and other improvements. So that's exciting news that moving forward with that. And that will, and even as they're continuing productions this season at the Calderwood and so on, but this will allow them to sort of be back up and running with programs sooner. So they did note that the building has been in dire need of renovation. Heating and cooling systems, as the theater manager said, held together with bubble gum and dreams. So Watertown Powerhouse, designed for international design firm Sasaki, is after decades, they're moving from Watertown into Boston, 110 Chauncey Street. So they've signed a lease for a 16-year lease for a new home, and so they're doing the design work as well. And it's a partnership with a MCRE, a small New York-based firm that also owns buildings in the Leather District and in Cambridge's Central Square. So having Sasaki signed up and helped with financing, and it's so the deal closed recently with MC Real Estate Partners. So anyway, cool building downtown, and it enables Sasaki selling the building in Watertown to the developer Berkeley Investments. They're going to convert it to lab space. Here's the old 80 West Broadway, the Amrines building, which has been locked in the corner, sort of battle related to the larger, the adjacent redevelopment, and showing the three renderings here. They're all, and Greg can like jump in and say they're all kind of in play here. Initially the building was going to be preserved, and then kind of out of the blue, it seemed that they said the sidewalk was too narrow and the building had to come down. There was a lot of pushback and uproar, and then they looked at, you can see some schemes with the right-hand scheme showing keeping the entire massing of the building, and then going up a few stories with all new block. And then more recently, they came back and said, okay, they'll preserve it, but what they're showing is preserving just the facade. So they're all kind of in play. I guess I think maybe the bottom left issue rendering where it's 2 stories higher might be their latest pitch, but there's been some pushback in terms of preservation and from the community and from Representative Lynch. We'll see how it plays out. This one wasn't on left it out of the agenda. I saw recently, though. I thought it was great to hear that here in Mumbai, there are, and everyone, Mumbai, of course, and India, all the architectural wonders of the world, and Gothic, a whole range of temples and churches and so on. There are these sort of neglected, amongst all that, these public drinking fountains that were a vestige of the British, the 19th century and the British rule. And most of they're sort of old and new ones, but these heritage ones from the 19th century, mostly not in operation. And so the city is engaged in, they're called payos, and a program to restore 30 of the heritage drinking fountains. And one of the nice things about the story is it's not only about preservation, but it's also, it's free water. It's really a kind of an equity kind of thing too, providing water to everyone that needs it for free. So it's an ongoing program, and just lovely to see. There are like so many range of different designs. Here in England, another cool story. In Somerset County, an English retiree worked for he was a retired bank official living in the small English town of Viveliscombe. Had no idea what was buried in his back garden when he hired a crew for a construction project to build a little bungalow. So it was known generally that there was this 13th century palace that was kind of a home for bishops. I don't know if they were retired bishops, but Bishop's Palace, as they called it, and the gate upper right still exists. So they knew that it was around somewhere, but it wasn't really known the extent of where it was. So you can see I'm sort of transitioning into archaeology. So that's one of the things Joe does. But anyway, they just found, they didn't know where it was, but then while this work was done, they found some of the walls, ruins from the palace. So thought that was pretty cool. I'm going to stop my share. Okay. There are other on the agenda. I guess in a minute I can also, just if anyone didn't get it, I'll copy the posting in the chat of the agenda. But you'll see there are also a bunch of announcements, and if we don't have time later, there are a number of programs, including even Boston Design Week and publications. MIT Press is making providing digital access to some rare and out of print books. So there's a lot of exciting stuff that's going on moving forward, and seminars, including I think an ongoing one about women in preservation. So check those out. So Joe Bagley is the city archaeologist, City of Boston archaeologist, historic preservationist, author, and staff member of the Boston Landmarks Commission. And so excited to have him here to talk about his book. And at this point, I'm in the agenda. I need to apologize for my excitement for finding an image. I actually posted the picture of the cover of his first book. I figured that all publicity is good. So I don't know if we'll talk about that, but we have it here at home, and it's really wonderful. So looking forward to hearing your talk, Joe. Welcome.
Everyone. So just a reminder, this is the cover of the book. Actually, I think that might be backwards. And I'm going to post a link in the chat right now that goes to the Brandeis University Press website, which has 3 links for how to get it directly from the press itself, online, Amazon, or through independent retail bookstores online. Excuse me.
By the way, your sound was not working. It was working, but
this has happened in the past, and I apologize for that. Still no. Okay. 1 second.
Okay. Might come back in. It worked before. Does anyone have any other, just for a minute here, any other current events or anything they want to share for a second?
Let me try one more thing.
Oh, sounds good.
Yeah, I don't know why it keeps cutting out though. I'm sorry about this, folks. Give me one more second. Lower my video.
Oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, we can. Yeah, you're right. I think you're
any better, any worse?
Yeah, you might have been patched into the Mars rover there for a minute.
Okay. I think that being plugged directly into City of Boston internet would be good enough, but maybe not.
No, it is cutting out a bit now.
Well, this is fun, isn't it? Sorry, folks. I don't know what's going on. Give me one more second. I'm going to switch to a computer. Talk amongst yourselves. I apologize for this. I'll be right back.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, if anyone has any news or any? Susan, sure. You want to talk about the plastics? Is that the conference proceedings plus? Is that out? Susan, sure.
I can mention I saw I attended a NAMP event yesterday about Boston City Hall and the new plans. Sasaki and someone from the city spoke about it. It was just so great to see what they're preserving and and how they're making it better. How they're preserving where those steps are in the plaza. They're inspired by the Siena Piazza, but they're taking out the actual steps, but leaving different stonework, so it has that same radiating pattern.
Oh, well, that's good to know.
Interesting. Yeah.
Want to try this
Yeah.
again?
Okay.
Is that any better?
It is, yeah, it is a little better.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. We did trial before this, but it seems like once we get a lot of people on the screen, then my internet here at the City Archaeology Lab isn't ideal. I am going to try sharing my screen, and it's the first time I've done it on this computer, so it's going to take me a minute. I apologize for that.
All right.
Sorry.
Where's the archaeology lab, or you're in?
I'm in
Hyde Park?
West Roxbury.
Okay.
Oh, please. Can you see that?
You can. Yes.
Excellent. Let's actually start, shall we?
All right.
Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you for your patience. My heart rate's going a little bit faster now, so I'll be talking extra fast, so we'll get through this in about 10 minutes.
No coffee needed.
So thank you all for coming this morning, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you all today. This is my very first time speaking about the book publicly, and this is somewhat of a trial by fire to some amazing professionals about the history included in this book. And I'm looking forward to your feedback, although I left my notebook in the other room, but I'll grab it maybe when we get to the Q&A section. First, I wanted to start by thanking Brandeis University Press, specifically Sue Raymond, the president, and Lillian Dunnage, who's the press coordinator, all the editors and the beta readers, including Jennifer, Jean, and Lori, for their incredibly hard work on this book. I couldn't have done it without them, and Brandeis made a beautiful book. It came out fantastic, beautiful print quality. Here's an example of the interior of the book with fantastic historic photographs. Can't thank the Boston Public Library enough and Historic New England for having their images scanned during COVID, because otherwise, I wrote most of this book in March and April of last year. So it was interesting to get access to some of the data while things were shut down. But that's a little preview of the inside. Overall, the book itself has three main goals. I wanted to celebrate the history of these buildings by telling an interesting story. I wanted to educate the general public about preservation efforts, especially the landmark and demolition laws in Boston. And I also wanted to talk about how preservation and landmarking and preventing demolition occurs as an active, proactive, or in response to threats to these buildings process. And I also wanted to prepare. One of the jokes that I've had about this book with my boss, Roseanne Foley at the Landmarks Commission, is at the end of all of this, I'm going to staple a landmark petition to the cover of the book and submit it to the Landmarks Commission and say, essentially, landmark everything that it's in here that isn't landmarked. And the reality is that only 6 of the buildings of the 50 are landmark designated in the city of Boston. And so there's a lot of ways that these buildings could be lost in the future. And hopefully this book lays a lot of the groundwork for establishing that significance so that in the future, if there is a threat, or if we wanted to proactively landmark these buildings, which would be better, we would have some of the things in place necessary to do that. So I work for the Landmarks Commission. I'm the staff archaeologist, but I'm also a historic preservationist. And it's really important to me to note that I'm not an architectural historian. And I think that that was one of the worries I had about writing this book, was that as a non-architectural historian, who am I to write a history of buildings in the city? But I very much took the approach to this book as an archaeologist, which is that it's not about the stuff, it's about the stories. And in this case, it's not about the architecture of these buildings, although that's certainly part of the stories. It's really about the significance to history and to the story of Boston that makes these sites important. So that's really what I wanted to focus on for the process. The Landmarks Commission is part of the Environment Department with a staff of dedicated preservationists, directed by Roseanne Foley. And just really quickly, many of you are familiar with this, but just wanted to go over quickly the differences between the National Register and the local Boston landmarks. Essentially, the National Register is an honorary designation for buildings. Many of the buildings in this book are nationally registered listed. Quite a few of them are actual National Historic Landmarks. Really the only difference between National Register and National Historic Landmark is an NHL is a building that's been nationally registered listed for national historic significance. But the reality is the protections in place for these types of buildings are very minimal. If you own a National Register property and you're doing changes to it on your own dime without needing permitting or licensing, you can do whatever you want to the buildings, including tearing them down. Whereas with a Boston landmark, besides it being a much more rigorous process, well, not really much more rigorous, much more specific process to establish above local significance currently in Boston, most of the changes to these buildings, including demolition and exterior changes, are reviewed by the Landmarks Commission, and it helps keep these buildings maintaining their overall historic integrity and appearance over time, and their character contributing properties to the city and the neighborhood and their micro neighborhoods as well. Overall, there's about 8,000 properties landmark designated in the city of Boston in 9 districts. And this map shows individual properties in red, which are kind of dominated by some of our large park systems. And then districts in blue, and it's a bit hard to see, but tucked in there on this scale is many individual properties downtown and throughout the city. Pinks are pending landmark properties, and there's a very large pending neighborhood district in the north end that is not shown on this map, but there's quite a few areas that haven't become full landmarks that are pending landmarks. And as a reminder, there are, I think, 6 total properties in this book that are landmark designated fully. I think there's over a dozen that are pending landmarks that haven't quite gotten that far. Quick overview of Demolition Delay. This is the famous garden building that was torn down in the early 90s. And in general, the process of demolition delay, which is called Article 85 in our zoning code, requires the review of buildings that are 50 years or older. And the staff of the Landmarks Commission are given 10 days to review submitted buildings that are about to be demolished and make a determination as to whether or not the building could be significant. If it could be significant, we require public meetings that have to present alternatives to demolition. And then at the end of that process, the BLC holds a public hearing. And at that point, the landmark commissioners choose whether or not to issue a 90-day demolition delay. And in theory, during that 90-day delay, if it's created, the idea is that the developer could apply alternatives and avoid demolishing the building, or possibly, and the building could be designated as a landmark during that 90 days. The reality is it's almost impossible to landmark designate a property in 90 days. And so that's something that we're actively trying to improve. Although some recent landmarks that are in the book have gone through multiple extensions of the delay in order to have enough time to establish the landmark status. Fundamentally, the challenge is the above local significance. There are many buildings that are significant to Boston, but our landmark laws require that the significance to these buildings be above local, meaning regional, state, or national significance. And that can be a really tall bar to get some of these buildings over, even though they may be incredibly important and maybe even referred to as landmarks in Boston. They may not be landmarks at the state or national level. So I have some ground rules in the book. I will talk about buildings at some point, I promise. I have some ground rules to the book, and these are important because they're somewhat arbitrary, but also I needed to have some boundaries as to where to discuss buildings in the 50, what of the 50 buildings that actually survive. So the first rule is that it must have, that I define a building as a structure with a roof and walls. And the reason why I did that was that there were numerous stone walls and steps that are preserved throughout the city. The steps for the Hancock Manor are preserved out in Jamaica Pond. Those are certainly old enough to be included in the book, but I wanted to include buildings that were both roofs and walls, structures like that, which would also eliminate all the stone walls throughout the city, which would have been quite a few in the book. It must be located within the current 2021 boundaries of Boston. There are some buildings that when they were built, they were in Boston, but they are no longer currently in Boston. Places like Winthrop, there's some old buildings there that used to be in Boston before the boundaries were redrawn. Building elements must be present above the foundations. And I did that actually for archaeological reasons. There's numerous old buildings whose foundations are still in the ground that if we dug them up, we could add them to this book, but I wanted to have it be above the foundations. That also eliminated quite a few buildings that are recorded as being built on top of older foundations. I really wanted it to be more quite literally superficial than the kind of basement elements of these buildings. It must be currently visible. There are quite a few landmarks that maybe or quite a few old buildings whose interiors may be old, but the exteriors are not. And I wasn't able to confirm the interiors during COVID or anything, frankly, because these are privately owned most of the time. So I wanted to make sure that that I excluded buildings whose no part of the exterior could be dated to an earlier period. They must be on land. Sorry, USS Constitution, but that eliminated it. It must be used for living humans. And I did that specifically because tombs have walls and roofs. And if we included all the tombs as buildings, we would have 55 or 50 tombs in the book instead of buildings. It must be approximately in the same order. And I did that specifically because the Capon House, which was built in Dorchester in the 1600s, has been disassembled, rebuilt in Milton, disassembled again, is now currently in storage. So that building, because it's not in its current configuration, I eliminated it from the book. For research, I've relied pretty heavily on the MACRIS system, the Massachusetts Cultural Resource Information Systems. It's really the go-to starting point for a lot of historic research. On the left is the website version of it, and on the right is the maps version of it. It's a great resource if you're not familiar with it, because it has a lot of the links to historic properties, historic districts. On the right is my neighborhood in Lower Mills, with one of my favorite houses nearby my house. I call it the Witch House, but it's the Marion Rose House, which has a funny little cone-shaped roof. I use this data to download basically all of the Boston buildings that were recorded in MACRIS, sort them by date, and use that as my starting point. I had originally a set of 100 buildings that I narrowed down to the 50 that ultimately made it to the book. But there was a lot of challenges in that process. So this is one of my favorite buildings in the whole book. It was a royal pain to research, but I got it in the book and got it into the dates. So it's number 36, the Elijah Jones House. But one of the challenges is some of the MACRIS forms are extremely brief. So on the right, it's almost impossible to read, but basically all it says is it looks pretty old. It was on a map in 1850, the end. That's the only information we had about the building to start from. And so from there, I researched a lot of the buildings it looks kind of old. And unfortunately, what that meant is that there's many buildings in the book that I researched, or many buildings that didn't make it to the book that I researched that unfortunately didn't make the cutoff. Ultimately, the youngest building in the book is 1794. So everything in the book is older than that. The other thing that I came across was buildings that fundamentally, after research, turned out to be not as old as they were reported to be. So this is the Major Pitcairn House at 130 Prince Street, a beautiful photo from the late 19th century. You can see the building in towards the middle is a narrower building in the middle, with the classic belt courses of brick in between the second and third stories and third and fourth story. That's pretty much the calling card of 18th century brick architecture built in Boston. If you see that, if you see a building in the North End, especially that has belt courses that is not in the book, please email me, because chances are you just found another 18th century building that needs to be added. Today, that building is the buff brick building kind of in the middle of this photograph. And when I started to do research on this, I was like, I don't know if this is the same building. So I did some line crosses, and you can see that the building on the far right, which is in both photographs, if you align the sills of the window with the current window locations, you can see that the floor structures don't align anymore. And based on the lack of anything above or below the windows or around the doors that are still intact, I actually eliminated the Pitcairn House from the book because I felt that there was no longer any exterior elements of the building that survive, and that there's a good chance that the actual interior of the building as well has been heavily modified to remove most of the 18th century components, given that the apparent floor locations has moved as well within the building. So this may be an entirely new building for all I know, but it's a building that I eliminated based on this research. And there's no exterior elements anymore. So overall, within the book, of the 50 buildings in the book, they break down pretty dramatically across most of the neighborhoods of Boston. I was really excited to see the spread of the buildings. Obviously, Dorchester, downtown, and the North End, and Charlestown, being some of the more older neighborhoods of Boston, came in with some of the larger numbers. But even places like Roslindale, Beacon Hill had buildings that made the cut. And Alston Brighton, I thought, was a surprising 4 buildings that made the pre-1794 cutoff for the book. So where did this all start? The actual historic preservation movement in Boston kind of got most of its start from the loss of the Hancock Manor. This building was built for Thomas Hancock in 1735 and eventually made it to his nephew, John Hancock. On John Hancock's deathbed, is claimed to have tried to give the house away to the state or to the Commonwealth, but he died before anything got signed. So essentially the building became it was unclear where the building should actually go. It was offered to the state for sale, but that sale fell through, and eventually it was sold at auction in 1863. The new owners of the building wanted to break it up into multiple building lots for the row houses that were being built on along the Common. And so they offered it for free if someone moved the building. That ultimately failed. And then the building was slated for demolition, triggering the construction of the printing of this massive broadside on June 6, 1863, begging the people of Boston to rise up and try to prevent the building from coming down. Ultimately, that failed. And even though the building was demolished, it ultimately led to the burgeoning preservation movement in Boston, given that incredibly significant, important buildings like the Hancock Manor were being torn down for future development. That was soon tested soon after the Great Fire of 1872. So the central photograph shows some of the burned buildings from the Great Fire that took out most of downtown. You can see in the distance Old South just narrowly surviving the fire. On the left is an etching that shows people of Boston on top of the roof, trying to put out the fire and embers that were landing on the roof, putting wet blankets on top of it. But just 2 years later, the congregation of Old South moved to Back Bay into the new Old South Meeting House, and the building was actually sold for scrap in June of 1874, with 60 days available to demolish the building completely. And you can see some of the detailed posters that were put on top of the building soon after. A clothing merchant and his son bought the rights to stop the demolition for 7 days, kind of a very early example of a demolition delay. There were massive meetings in Old South where a lot of these quotes were spoken and then added to the outside of the building, begging Bostonians to stop the tearing down of Old South. Ultimately, it was a group of 20 Boston women who formed the Old South Association, which is still around, raised or borrowed money to purchase the building and the land under it in October 1876. It actually became the first historic building in New England to be saved for preservation. Almost exactly 100 years later, the Landmarks Commission got its start. By 1874, there was an op-ed in Boston. Well, before that, by the 1940s, 70 cities in the United States, more than 70 cities in the United States had landmarks commissions. But by 1874, Boston had not. There was an op-ed in the Globe that said part of the problem seems to be that no one realizes that there is a problem because Boston happens to be lucky enough to have a lot of good old buildings still around. Many people assume that someone must be keeping an eye on them. Well, no one is. In 1975, architect Leslie Larkin formed the City Conservation League specifically to fight the demolition of the building shown in this photograph, the 1860s Jordan Marsh building. Unfortunately, that didn't work, and the building was torn down, but ultimately that led to the passing of state legislation that created the Boston Landmarks Commission in 1975. So unfortunately, this is not a pattern that's only unique to Boston, it's around the world. It takes the loss of important historic structures to trigger the creation of rules and organizations that actually lead to the preservation of these buildings. So ultimately, hopefully, we won't have to lose one of the buildings in this book in order to have the rest of them be preserved indefinitely. So we really came for with the buildings. I wanted to show 3 buildings that I feature in the book. One of them because I think it's a little bit surprising that it's in the book. The second one because I think it's not really a looker, and I think that that's an important part of historic preservation is to preserve buildings that have significant history, even if they're ugly. And the last one is featuring some of the new things I think that this book adds. I do digital reconstructions. I've done animations of landscape restorations in the city for a couple of years now. And there's multiple buildings in the book whose appearance has changed pretty dramatically over the years. And so one of the things that I've done is I've created digital reconstructions of the original appearances of buildings, some of the buildings in the book. And the last building I'll feature today includes some of those reconstructions of buildings. So this is a building that I knew was going to be in the book, but I didn't think it was going to be within the top 10. So the Boston Light Station was supposed to be in here in the late 1700s, but ultimately ended up much earlier in 1716. So I've actually got some reading to do, so bear with me. So the many islands in Boston, this is straight from the book. The many islands in Boston's deep harbor posed a threat to navigation in the dark. Jasper Danker, who has the best name in history, a Dutchman touring the American colonies, documented the first known lighthouse in Boston on Little Brewster Island in 1679. Little Brewster belongs to a group of small rocky islands on the eastern edge of Boston Harbor. They were named after the Brewster family of the Mayflower and Plymouth fame. Technically, the earliest documented beacon mentioned by Danker would have actually been located in the town of Hull, who owned the islands in the 17th century, but it had likely been in place for several decades by the time it was first mentioned by Danker. No further description of the early beacon is known, but it was probably a combination of a vessel or container containing a substantial fire that was raised on some sort of pole or structure to increase its visibility across the harbor, basically a gigantic fire on a stick. In 1713, John George, a Boston merchant, successfully petitioned the General Court of the Massachusetts colony, probably doing so in the old State House building, which is building number 7 in the book, for a larger beacon at the southern point of Beacon Island, as Little Brewster was known at the time. His petition was successful, and work began on the beacon in July of 1714. The builders constructed the tower using stone rubble and put a small structure on top to hold a fire that was lit from sunset to sunrise each day. On September 14, 1716, George Worthy Lake, the first keeper of the lighthouse, lit the beacon for the first time. George, his wife Anne, their daughter Ruth, their servant George Cutler, and their enslaved man Shadwell were to live on the island year-round to maintain the light. Tragically, the entire Worthy Lake family, Cutler, Shadwell, and a friend of the family named John Edge, drowned in Boston Harbor in 1718 when their boat capsized on their way back from church on the mainland. The Worthy Lake family is buried together on a triple headstone and granary burial ground that you can see here. In 1720, the fire at the top of the tower got out of hand, causing damage to the overall structure, including large cracks in the stone walls. The structure was soon damaged again by a massive storm in 1723. Still, the tower stood until the Revolution. In 1775, Boston rebels chose to burn down the upper parts of the structure deliberately to prevent the British regulars from using it during the siege of Boston. On March 17, 1776, all of Boston watched anxiously as the defeated British evacuated Boston for Nova Scotia. Though the fleeing ships did not burn the city of Boston, as it was worried that would happen as they left, they did choose to blow up Boston Light Station in Boston Harbor. Still needing a lighthouse, Bostonians raised a bucket of burning coal or wood to the top of a pole each night on the island for several years afterwards. In 1780, Governor John Hancock requested that the town build a new lighthouse. Between 1780 and 1783, a new Boston Light Station was built on the ruins of the old, using the old 25-foot wide base and raising the rubble wall to 75 feet in height with a 15-foot tall lantern on the top to house the light. The new light had 161-gallon whale oil burners inside of 4 separate lamps, giving it much greater visibility. In 1790, all lighthouses along the coast were formally ceded to the federal government. At the time of the transfer, Little Brewster Island included the light, a house for the lightkeeper, a boathouse, storage shed, paint shed, and oil house, most of which are still there. Boston Light remained in good condition for decades, but in 1809, iron rings that are still visible on the building today were added to the top as a support for the stone walls. The next major change occurred in 1856 when the lantern was upgraded to increase its visibility for 16 miles. The structure took its current and final form in 1859 when the tower height was increased to 98 feet tall and the lantern was upgraded so that it would spin. Most recently, the tower was restored ahead of its 300th anniversary by the U.S. Coast Guard. During this renovation, the original 1716 elements of the building were documented, proving that the original tower survives as part of the current structure. So in this image, you actually see that there's some smaller stones towards the bottom, 2 courses of the stonework that actually go down further that have slightly more regular shape, and then there's larger stones on top of that. And the idea is that the smaller, more regular stones are part of the original structure, the 1716 original structure, and the later, that was basically the base rubble of the building that exploded, and the larger stones were added later, which is why the building got kicked to 1716 and not the later reconstruction after the Revolution. It's kept today by Sally Snowman, a civilian, and it remains the last staffed lighthouse in the country. Sally is actually the first and only woman keeper of the light. I think she's the first woman in the history of the 70 other light keepers that have been at this place over 300 years. So she plays a really important part in the story. In May 20, and she was actually the one that published about the earlier part of the building being preserved. In May 2020, the U.S. General Services Administration announced that it was interested in transferring the stewardship of Boston Light to a new owner, essentially making it a private building. Though it's a National Historic Landmark, it is not a Boston landmark. So again, since Boston landmarks have to be above local significance, it seems pretty easy to justify that any building that's already a National Historic Landmark, being of national significance, should be able to become a Boston landmark by just simply it being above local significance. But it is not currently a Boston landmark. So changes that happen to it, if done by private owners using private funds, do not need to be reviewed by the Boston Landmarks Commission. Now we're on to the ones that don't quite look like the most oldest buildings in Boston. Though it's hard to tell today, the Clapp Field House traces its history back to one of the more prolific Dorchester families, which owned multiple properties listed in the book. The Clapp family settled first at the northern end of Dorchester, which is included in the history of building number 4 in the book. But by the end of the 18th century, the Clapp descendants could be found throughout Dorchester. One enclave of the Clapp family, which is spelled both with 1 P or 2 Ps, depending on who it is in the family, was near what would become Fields Corner at the intersection of Dorchester and Adams Street. Like most 17th century streets in Boston, Adams Street likely began its history as a Massachusetts native trail that followed the transition between higher dry land and the marshy lands along Boston's shoreline. Adams Street extends south from the area that would become the early core of Dorchester around the Meeting House Hill down to the bridge over the Neponset River at Lower Mills. Along the street length, multiple families owned massive farm estates, often meadows and orchards on the west side of Adams Streets with grasslands and along the shoreline salt marshes to the east. At either end of the street were more built-up anchors of the two cultural and economic centers of the town of Dorchester, but the area in between was relatively quiet, while also being physically well connected to these anchors. It was in this central area that the Robinson and Clapp families settled. While the Robinsons would be more visible in the Fields Corner historic record due to their ownership of more land and the longevity of their name in the area, the Robinsons and the Clapps married each other into each other's families and together owned much of the area around Fields Corner. In 1772, Samuel Clapp, a housewright, purchased a lot from Edward Breck in the sparsely developed area that would become Fields Corner. It is likely that Samuel himself was responsible for the building of his house soon afterwards, which is shown in this photograph. Just want to have a quick note here. Throughout the book, I made it one of my pet peeves about books that talk about buildings is giving credit to the construction of the building by the person who wrote the check for the building. So I make it a clear point throughout the book. I'm only saying so-and-so built the house if they actually built the house. If they paid for the building of the house, then they're credited as funding the house or had the house built, but they're not given credit as building the house because that erases the masons, the woodworkers, the folks that actually built these houses from that historic record and gives it to people that actually didn't do the work. In this case, since Samuel Clapp was a housewright, I thought it was fairly fair to give him credit for the building of this house, assuming that he actually built it, but it felt like that was probably accurate. He probably didn't build it by himself, but still. Clapp built a large late Georgian house with all the popular design elements at the time, including a shallow hipped roof angling in from all 4 sides, prominent chimneys along the outer walls of the house, a symmetrical facade featuring a central door, 5 bays of windows along the front and 4 bays down the side. This photo from the house in the late 19th century shows that there was also a large barn behind the house, which you can see just on the left, and a fence made of pudding stone and wood, and a classically inspired porch covering that probably dates to the Greek Revival period of the mid 19th century. It is no surprise that the house is described as a mansion in Samuel's probate records in the 1820s. Until this point, the house had remained largely outside of historic documentation. I found almost no mention of there even being a house between Samuel Clapp buying the property in the late 1700s and 1820 when he died and the house went on. This is fairly typical of large farm estates where there's just not a lot of records going on about building and tearing down buildings, but there's maybe stuff about their lives, but not about the buildings themselves. It remained largely out of historic documentation, though the Clapps and nearby Robinson family raised children in the area and farmed the land and intermarried in several occasions. Samuel Clapp Jr. received the house from his father's estate in 1924, but immediately sold it. The house then went through multiple owners, including the Reed, Oliver, Burbeck, and Glover families, before it was purchased in 1838 by Isaac Field. In 1804, Boston laid out Dorchester Avenue, a straight highway connecting Boston directly to Lower Mills. It crossed the far older Adams Street at a really oblique angle, creating a distinctly narrow intersection you can see on the right and on the left. Here, early industry sprang up on the crossroads that brought new economic opportunities. It was also coincidentally the precise location of the Clapp Field House, which had been standing in relatively quiet area of Dorchester, but now was just east of a major intersection. The photo, the map on the left shows the Clapfield house basically in the intersection of the two roads. Though this radically changed the landscape of the region, it also increased the visibility of the Staley home. Near the new home and intersection, Isaac Field and his brother Enos opened a general store. The presence of the store and the entire Field family, which had over 5 households in the immediate vicinity of the intersection, resulted in the area gaining the name of Field's Corner. The intersection's name later lost the apostrophe, becoming Field's Corner without the apostrophe. In late 1880s, the Field family moved the Clapfield house to the rear of the building lot and built a large brick commercial building on the street. You see that in the aerial photograph. In the 1890s, the Field family decided to sell the entire property, and it passed into the ownership of Patrick O'Hearn, who converted the brick building, which was formerly performance space, partially performance space, added a narrow addition to the rear of the building and connected the Clapfield house to the back of the brick building, turning it all into a massive storage facility and adding a brick cladding to the house, which is seen today. All of that happened around 1918. A recent examination by Historic Boston Incorporated revealed that the house retains many of its original interior features. The Clapfield house has no state or federal historic designations and is not currently a Boston landmark, despite being one of the oldest buildings in Boston. Ooh, I'm talking fast. Anyway, the last house we're going to feature today is house number 44, the John Hurd House, circa 1790. I worked a lot with the Charlestown neighborhood on this book, folks from the Charlestown Historical Society and various people, and they really fought for this house being on the book. I had it at 1795, and they really wanted the house included, and we managed to get it back to 1790. So it made the cut, which is great because I love the story of this building. In the 1780s, Deacon John Larkin, who was famous for loaning his house to Paul Revere for the midnight ride, he went on a land buying spree in Charlestown that resulted in his ownership of most of the north side of Main Street, from what's today Winthrop Street to Monument Street, a really important piece of real estate in Boston. Larkin appeared to have his own home at the corner of Winthrop and Main Street, just to the right of where you see this photograph. That building is now number 43 in the book. He may have also funded the construction of what would become the John Hurd House at the opposite end of the property on Main Street. As is the case of Larkin House, the exact construction date of the Hurd House is not clear. Sometime around 1790, builders constructed a large, nearly square 2-story house with 5 bays on each side, with the main entrance at the wider side of the house facing Main Street. You'll note that the image here is there's a 3-story building with a wider facade, take my word for it, facing Monument Street on the left, but let's fix that. The house they built was a late Georgian in style with broad windows and doorways, symmetrical facade, and a rare flat deck on hip roof. The corner block coins are probably part of the original decorative elements of the exterior of this building. John Hurd purchased the building for his family home in 1833, several decades after it was first built. Hurd was a wealthy merchant who traded in West Indies goods and had an office in the relatively newly built 1825 Quincy Market downtown. In the early 19th century, probably around 1833, when he bought the house, Hurd funded the raising of its roof to allow for the addition of a 3rd story. The corner coins increased slightly in size from the 2nd to 3rd story, marking this addition. The Hurd House reached its literal turning point in 1868 when the construction of Monument Street required that the house be moved. The Hurd family chose instead to rotate the house 90 degrees clockwise and move it 8 feet closer to the Larkin house on the right to make more room for the street. At the time, the Hurd family moved out but retained ownership of the house, converting it into commercial space and apartments. To accommodate the rotation and new function of the house, the Hurds filled the original front entrance and 2 flanking windows, all of which were now facing Monument Street. The 1st floor living space was converted into multiple commercial spaces, and there was a small addition added to the rear of the property. The parlors and kitchen spaces were gutted, a process that included removing most of the interior walls of the building and replacing them with iron supports. The upper floors were split into 2 apartments, and the floors of the 1st story were lowered 16 inches to make more room for 1st floor commercial space and to also allow people to walk directly in from the street. In recent renovations, evidence of the lowering was found, including mortises and sawed-off tenons along the frame of the house from the lowered floor. John Rand moved into the building, selling furs, hats, and trunks and furnishings out of 71 Main Street, which is the storefront closest to the corner, while living above the shop. He occupied the space from around the time of the 1868 conversion of the property to 1885. Around 1870, William Murray and Son opened a dry goods store in 67 and 69 Main Street on the right. Like Rand, the Murrays remained in the property for many years and eventually bought the Hurd House in 1879 from John Hurd's children. In 1922 or 23, Donovan Fallon pharmacists purchased the house from the Murrays. By then, there were 3 separate apartments above the 2 first-floor commercial spaces. Around 1923, Dunn and Fallon renovated the commercial space at the corner of Monument and Main Streets, adding a decorative stained glass nameplate over the plate glass storefront windows and the green marble cladding to the windows base. Pharmacy would remain in the building's owners until 1964, though the upper apartments had become vacant by the 1930s. As Charlestown faced an economic decline in the mid-20th century, the arrival of the elevated railway on Main Street in 1899, which is just off to the right in this image, greatly affected the value of the commercial and rental units along its route. Regardless, throughout the 1970s, a pharmacy remained in the building after Donovan and Fallon left, but the building began to fall into disrepair. In 1981, Historic Boston Incorporated purchased the Hurd House, and using funds that included grants from the Massachusetts Historic Commission, it was able to make the repairs necessary to prevent the building from collapsing and restore the exterior. Charlestown residents purchased the property from HBI and completed the restoration of the apartments and commercial spaces in the building. The John Hurd House is a National Register listed property, but it is not a Boston landmark. Its well-restored and maintained exterior adds attractive commercial and residential space to the streetscapes along the main street, and the building currently houses a cafe and popular restaurant, although I don't know if it does anymore. It did at the time that I published this. Who knows what's going on now, or what comes back after COVID.
It does. The
Oh, good.
Charlestown Tea and Treats is still
Great.
open.
That's good to hear. I had a meeting in there about 2 years ago to talk about the book, and it's good to know they're still there. So I'm going to start wrapping up. First thing I wanted to kind of point out was that part of the fun of this the book was doing the research that went into writing the book. And there's one building in the book in particular, the Grant House in the North End, which I won't say I discovered, but it was one of the buildings that was recorded as being in the 1820s, and based on some architectural features, I had suspicion that it was actually an 18th century building. And after a lot of research, I was able to kick the building all the way back to the 1730s. So there are probably other buildings like that. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see over the next year or so if people start to bring up buildings that weren't in the top 50 that may be something that people have heard about or thought about or are suspicious of being older buildings. And I've already talked to the publisher about the fact that this book may trigger pretty significant edits if people start finding other buildings that are hiding in plain sight that we just didn't know about. Since so many of the buildings in the book are based on architectural surveys done by the Landmarks Commission for the Mass Historical Commission, if an architectural historian didn't do all of the deed work for every building in a neighborhood, which frankly is impossible on the scale of the budgets that are for these projects, there may be things that just fell through the cracks that I didn't notice, that they didn't notice, and that ultimately we may be able to add even more buildings to this list. When I first started the research, there were buildings that were from the 1790s that were meant to be in the book that ended up getting bumped off. In fact, when I first started researching or started really writing the book in earnest last March, the Otis House in the West End was meant to be the last building in the book, but then over time that ended up getting kicked off because it was literally 1 year too old or too young to make the cutoff in the book. I want to end second to last slide with a quote that was actually spoken by William H. Murray inside of Old South in plea for saving the building that I think kind of represent. I actually opened the book with this quote: "Take away these expressions of the soul, of the life of Boston, and what, I ask, have you left beyond any other city on the continent?" That's really what it boils down to. The old buildings of Boston create the city of Boston. They identify the city of Boston. They're part of the character. They're part of the story. They're part of the reason why people come here. They're part of the reason why people work here. They're the reason why Boston's on the map, essentially, is its history and its old house stock and building stock. It's what people come to see. So that if we lose these buildings that create this kind of historic infrastructure of the city, what do we have left, really? Ultimately, the question that I'm asking in this book is, should all of these buildings be saved? And I'm going to leave that with you all. I put a link at the beginning of the talk, how to get access to the book. It should be in bookstores in print if you can, if it's safe to go to a bookstore. It should be there soon. If you've pre-ordered the book, you should have gotten it by now, or very shortly. The book is now being shipped. Its official release date, I think, is until the 24th. And yeah, I think that's it. So I wanted to thank you all for coming, and I hope there's some time for some questions if you have any.
Thank you, Joe. That was wonderful. Hey, and the proceeds for the book go
thank you.
to,
Yes. So as a City of Boston employee, I'm not allowed to keep any money for the writing of the book. I was able to write the book on my city clock, which was nice. But every nickel of money that this book makes for the author proceeds goes towards the Boston Landmark Commission to fund outreach and education. So things like our going to classrooms, having signs made, having pins made, which will be coming up soon too. But anything that we need for making sure that people know more about Boston landmarks and Boston history, that's what this will go towards.
that's great. I can't wait to get a copy. Thank you. Well, I'll kick off. I had a question, I guess, about the cladding. And you showed the example of the brick cladding being added. Obviously, not only in Boston, but around the country, there's a tradition, into the early to mid 20th century with cladding, with all these wonderful modern materials like vinyl and metal cladding for commercial storefronts that covered up Victorian facades and so on. But did you start to see any patterns for like the materials or why the cladding might have occurred like that? Was it ostensibly to make it fireproof? Or?
I didn't see any patterns for the justification for it, but I definitely noticed that it was seemingly in the 70s and the 80s that many of the buildings got vinyl cladding, if they were to get vinyl cladding, and definitely the ones that were outside of downtown, the North End and Charlestown. If it wasn't in those three neighborhoods, it was much more likely to get the cladding just in general. And I think it was more of an effort of the folks that were owning these buildings trying to reduce the amount of work and labor that went into maintaining the exteriors of the buildings, which ultimately means that hopefully underneath the 70s and 80s vinyl cladding, there's decently relatively intact earlier wood cladding, I hope. But we'll see how it goes if these things get restored. But one of the nice things about the landmark status on some of these buildings is that if they are currently vinyl clad, over the course of the building's history, that will start becoming undone and restored back to the original historic cladding if they're still there. One of the buildings.
I didn't mean to emphasize the sort of the modern facelifts. I was wondering if you're sounding sort of historic trends with like the brick cladding over a timber frame building.
The only one that really had that was the Clapp Field House. I definitely noticed that the buildings in downtown were switching from wood to brick around 1710 because of the threats of fire. And there was actually regulations in the city's history that said you had to switch the kind of building material. But as far as cladding goes, no, I haven't noticed that being a trend outside of only a few of the buildings that actually got things like brick cladding. And then some of the Pierce House in Dorchester is in the book with a photograph of the the lean-to on the back of the building actually preserves 17th century original wooden clapboards, which is some of the only original exterior of a 17th century building that survived in the country. It's a really important piece of architectural history in Boston. And if you can go see it later this year, please go see it. It's one of the really cool pieces of history in Boston.
Anybody have questions?
Could you explain that you mentioned there's a telltale, this is David Tor, when you have that line of bricks on across the facade, could you get more into detail on that? I've seen that it sort of projects out a sort of an inch. Is that true?
So where that is it's where the floor joist of the building intersect with the wall, and the bricks are moved out slightly to give a spot for the wood to actually sit into the wall. And I think really what it is around 1750 or so, a little bit later in some areas, that seems to be replaced by some other type of architectural element. I didn't really learn more about it because it just disappears. But up until that point, the standard was to add these. It's fairly decorative, but also somewhat practical. But it seems to be on every single building that's brick in the book that predates about 1750, which pretty much narrows it down to downtown and North End and Charlestown, those kinds of areas. But well, not Charlestown because that burned down, but the older neighborhoods near the core of the downtown Boston. But every one of the buildings in here that is brick from that time period has the belt course.
Yeah, the old house next to the Old North Church has that.
Yeah, and that building is number 6.
Yeah, that's a great building.
I'm guessing that a lot of times that's not necessarily the beam pockets for the beams, because the beams might have been for a narrow proportion, maybe running parallel to the street facade. I'm wondering if a ledge, like a ledger board, a sill, where it was embedded, and that would be, running parallel to the brick, and they bump the brick out.
And it seems like it was somewhat stylistic too. Like it started off as a practical thing, but it seems to have evolved into more of just a decorative thing, as most things do. So it's not necessarily a functioning thing by the tail end of that time period, but it is something that seems to be on all of the buildings that survive from that period. It's not a guarantee, but if you see one of them that isn't in the book, it might very well be an early 18th century structure that we should do some more research on, especially if some cladding comes off an old building in the north end. I have a deep suspicion that there are multiple 18th century buildings hiding in the north end that we just don't know about yet, that have just been sitting in plain sight for 300 plus years.
Yeah, because there was no Great Fire there.
Right. Looking at the list of questions. What suggestions do you have to push saving of these buildings by interested parties? Basically, I've tried to lay the groundwork in this book for the justification of significance for landmark designation for all these buildings. Ultimately, the two things that save buildings are, besides people, are landmark designation and preservation restrictions. Preservation restrictions, you really need to have the cooperation of a homeowner, property owner. Landmark can be done without direct approval by the owner of the property. The petitions that you need to sign start with reaching out to the Landmarks Commission. It's a long process, but we can at least start the process to get some of these things at the very least pending landmarks. But the big step that has to happen, that's the most arduous, is the study report that comes after the landmark the hearing, because that takes an incredible amount of research and study of that individual property or neighborhood sometimes. That takes money, that takes time, and that's not something that the Landmarks Commission necessarily has to pay at that moment. So we have tons of pending landmarks that have been voted to the point of being pending until they get the study report to become full landmarks, which allows some oversight of these buildings over time. But to have full landmark status requires those study reports. And the funding can cost $10,000+ per study report. And if we don't have that budget, then we can't put forward the landmark petition, or at least the get it fully landmarked. However, if anybody wanted to fund it, those study reports, we could then use that money, or independently fund it even. The study reports has to be made. It doesn't matter who's done it as long as it's qualified, the person that did it. So those study reports can then feed into the system to make these buildings landmarked. But every one of these buildings should have the data available that can start that process. And it requires 10 signatures by Boston residents or a city councilor or the mayor to start that process, or landmark commissioner to get a landmark petition going. Is there grants available to fund such research? I think that yes is the short answer. Specific ones, they tend to be more for the actual preservation of the buildings than for the research that goes into preserving these buildings. A lot of the funding that we get from the state, for example, goes into doing the surveys to get the forms, the fundamental forms to establish the basic significance of these buildings across whole neighborhoods rather than individual properties, which is a lot of what the research would do. But we have not been terribly successful in getting additional grants for individual landmark property reports. I'm reading through to see if there's other questions. That looks like all the questions in the chat. Anybody else have a question?
Mhm.
All right.
I guess I mentioned that being here in Charlestown, and we live not far from where the Middlesex Canal sort of terminated, but I guess I'm wondering if any of the houses had kind of connections to early transportation, like canal.
None of them turned up with canal.
No.
The one that comes closest to that is actually the last building in the list. It's the Salem Turnpike Hotel, which is just off of the Winthrop Square training field in Charlestown, depending on how you want to call it. And that was not actually that long of a history as a hotel, but the Salem Turnpike that started up in Salem and went down the East Coast terminated just outside of that building. with the original alignment of the roads, which is kind of defunct now after the big dig. But the hotel started its life off, and it was only a hotel for a couple of decades, but then became a private home and has since been a private home. There's a reconstruction that I did, a digital reconstruction in the book. The alignment of where the two buildings that are the Salem Turnpike Hotel and the neighboring property, the actual building was kind of one continuous building, and the transition between one building and the next seems to have changed over time. So I did a reconstruction of where, if the original building's edges were preserved, what building would be red, what building would be gray, that kind of thing. Because I don't know how it broke down in the deeds, but the building itself has kind of moved its edges within the main structure, which is kind of, you'll have to see it. It makes sense visually. Yeah, so Greg asked a good question about the current discussions of changing the requirement of local significance being sufficient to be a Boston landmark. So there's an ongoing effort by many people, both in the city and outside of the city, to re-examine the Boston Landmark Commission's rulings. Currently, the big word is an and versus an or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but basically the significance in the statement for the law that creates the landmark designation is that it has to be above local significance. And that can be changed with the change of a single word to include local significance, which would mean that we would be able to landmark designate buildings and structures and resources and sites and buildings, ships and clocks that are significant to the local history. And that would dramatically increase our ability to landmark buildings in Boston. So obviously that'll have a lot of pushback from development, but it would, if that change happens, then that will allow for most of these buildings that maybe don't rise to the level of national significance or even state significance, that those will be possibly saved because of that, if we can change it. And I know that I think there's a group of city people that are currently looking at that process. Although I think with the transitions that are happening right now, I'm not sure if that's going completely smoothly or if it's coming in fits and bursts. But once that dust settles, we should be able to see kind of where that ends up at the other end. Somebody asked about digital reconstructions. I used Photoshop. I took a picture of the building and I hacked the photo to pieces, added bits of other buildings to it, and twisted and turned the building until it looks right. So it's in no way a 3D rendering, which would be nice, but the vast majority of this book was written between March and April of last year when things were very much shut down. So I was 100% in my basement working on this book, and came out, I think, for 2 days of waiting for the weather to get decent to take photographs of these buildings before the leaves came out and covered up half the buildings. So you'll look in a lot of the buildings have pretty gray skies and not the most colorful settings, but if I waited too long, the leaves would have covered up most of these buildings so you couldn't see any of them. So I had this window of time to get photos that weren't, Christmas decorations, Halloween decorations, and snow, but also weren't covered in leaves, although that would have made it for a nice photograph. There's literally buildings in here that would have been invisible if the leaves came out.
Well, in your basement and in your zone there, the Hurd House, that's awesome, that graphic, so.
And you had another book. I noticed you have another book about artifacts, which looks like it's based on the British Museum book, which is fabulous.
It was a complete knockoff of the British Museum ID.
Yeah.
No, do that. And this is frankly a knockoff of Harry Potter's title, the Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. The 50 Artifacts book has been out for a few years now, but it starts from native history and goes up to, I think, the 1980s. Through the artifacts that have been found throughout the city of Boston, which is much more my wheelhouse. But this was one of those things where I started to do some messing around with Macros and managed to get it to spit out the 100 oldest buildings in Boston. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And I put it online and it got picked up by a Boston History Facebook page and kind of went pretty far. And I was like, oh, there seems to be really people want to know this information. And then I was just about, actually the 50 Artifacts book was done, was about to come out. And I was like, there seems to be a real appetite for the story. I started doing research as to whether or not the book had been written already, because I assumed I wasn't the first person to say, let's make a ranked list of Boston oldest building. There were a couple of buildings that were basically the oldest buildings in Boston, but they were just a bunch of old buildings almost exclusively downtown, and they weren't the oldest buildings. So they were just a bunch of old buildings essentially, and not inclusive of the neighborhoods. So I took the approach of, we're going to start in Charlestown, we're going to end in Hyde Park, and go out to West Roxbury and look at everywhere. As far as I'm aware, and we did a lot of research to confirm this is the first time the buildings have ever been surveyed holistically across the city to make a ranked order of the oldest buildings. And actually, I need to get some of this information back to the Mass Historical Commission, because a lot of what I found disagrees with what their official records are. So they're going to need to update some of the documents, and everything that I found is backed up in primary sources. So hopefully the research is good and holds up over time. But yeah, this was a lot of deeds, probates, census records, and thank goodness all of that's been scanned and we can get to it online, because that would have been really hard to do in March and April of last year. But I am very familiar with deeds at this point and how to do that exhaustive process. But there's a lot of good information in those.
Well, messing around with Macris is definitely going to be the title of a future program. But until then, thank you very much. Thanks again, Joe. This was great. Really appreciate it. And just folks, if you do check out on the agenda events that are coming up, including this evening, starting out on the back page, I was listing webinars sponsored by the Middle Tennessee State University Department of History and Public History about race, gender, indigeneity, and the meaning of narrative and excavated past. That's this evening. And then on the 22nd, some former Park Service heavyweights talking about abolition, secession, and the interpretation of diverse histories at the National Park Service. And then other things coming up. So I mentioned Boston Design Week. There are a number of events, including talking about the Christian Science Plaza revitalization, the future of Fenway, restoring historic property, and a virtual tour of the North Bennett Street School. So that's part of Boston Design Week. And then reglazing modernism, an APT program, intervention strategies for steel frame glazed enclosures. That's Wednesday the 14th. And there are others. So with that, thank everyone. Thanks for participating, coming, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Joe.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Jack.
All right.
Good program.